Welcome to the podcast, Life is a Story We Tell Ourselves. This week, your host Don Murphy is joined by the founder and editor-in-chief of National Parks Traveler, Kurt Repanshek. National Parks Traveler is a #1 ranked editorially independent nonprofit media organization that provides daily news, feature, and commentary coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's journalists work to inform the general public of environmental, scientific, and newsworthy developments surrounding, involving, and affecting these areas and their governing bodies. As the COVID-19 pandemic has taken a hold of the world, ironically, more people have sought to escape to the outdoors, and visitation to parks has increased, causing tremendous pressure on delicate resources and bringing a new breed of visitor. That visitor is often unfamiliar with park etiquette and has led many to ask, are we loving our parks or loving them to death? Kurt will share his thoughts on this subject and other issues affecting our parks. And Kurt doesn't just write about our parks. He has climbed the Grand Teton, river rafted the Grand Canyon, hiked Mount Ranier, and taken his family on trips to many of the National Park Service's most sacred historical and cultural sites. Thank you for joining us. Let's listen together.
Kurt, tell us how you got started in the first place with the National Park Service producing a travel magazine, and I bet you loved parks as a kid or something.
I did love parks as a kid, and I think the first national park we ever went to was Acadia National Park. And for a middle-class family growing up in New Jersey, it was an interesting adventure driving all the way to Maine. I was a young boy, about 7 or 8 years old, and it was quite the experience. But we always got National Geographic in the house every month, and I, fell in love reading its pages and all the natural places that it would take you to. It was a wonderful adventure every month.
I love those. You've said two things that we highlight on this show, and that has to do with connections, and then reading things that influenced us as a child, influenced our stories. So the two connections that are made immediately, I just had Audrey Peterman on the show, and her first experience with the national parks was with Acadia, and that's where she had, her transformative experience in parks was at Acadia. And then you mentioned National Geographic magazine, how that was an influence. Same in my family, but it wasn't National Geographic magazine. It was Sunset magazine. And I don't know if you ever met the publisher, Bill Lane, and his brother Mel over the years, but we ended up becoming good friends which was something that was, if my mother was still alive, it would have blown her mind to think that I would have ever been friends with the publisher of Sunset magazine.
Yeah. He left quite a legacy, and I was fortunate enough to write for Sunset for a number of years, and actually got a fellowship at Stanford University at the Bill Lane Center.
That's great. I mean, he was a great guy. Well, that's an interesting segue to talk about the Great Americans Outdoors Act, because Bill Lane attended a conference that we sponsored in California back in the 90s to try to revitalize the Land and Water Conservation Fund. And Bill Lane was a very big part of that, and funded our early effort and the founding of Americans for Our Heritage and Recreation, which made a big push back in the 90s to revitalize the Land and Water Conservation Fund. Just wanted to get your thoughts on the Great Americans Outdoors Act and finally getting the Land and Water Conservation Fund fully funded. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your thoughts about that act and what it means for national parks?
Well, I think it's a good start, and the Park Service is going to roughly have, I think, $1.3 billion a year over the next 5 years to spend on catching up with its maintenance backlog, which last time I checked was right around $12 billion. And it's still growing at several $100 million a year. At the end of fiscal 18, the most recent figure I saw was the maintenance backlog had increased $313 million. And that same year, the Park Service was able to spend roughly $700 million on maintenance. So there's a challenge here in trying to get ahead of that accruing maintenance price tag, if you will. And so $6.5 billion is certainly nice. It's a windfall of sorts, but it's not going to get the Park Service out of the problems it faces in terms of the $12 billion backlog and the annual accrual.
Yeah, and the National Park Service in that regard is really a microcosm of the country, because we have infrastructure and maintenance problems all over this country. And the National Park Service, I think if you go to most parks, you can see right there staring you in the face what some of the problems are. The interesting juxtaposition here is that the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which was originally established in 1965 and had a state side of the fund that funded everything from swimming pools to baseball fields to acquisition of state parks, and then the federal side funding everything from the acquisition of new national parks to wildlife areas, national forests, easements, all of those sorts of things. And one of the battles that's existed over the years is whether or not we should be spending money on acquisition of new lands when we have maintenance backlogs and all of these challenges within our national parks and in states as well. I wonder what your thoughts are. What do you fall down on either side of that argument, more acquisition versus maintenance, or what are your thoughts?
I'm kind of caught in the middle. I know a number of years ago, I wrote an editorial that the Senate really needed to address the maintenance backlog in the park system before adding new units. Mm-hmm. And I think Tom Coburn, when he was in the Senate, actually mentioned that on the Senate floor, which gained me some infamy with some of my friends in the parks community. It's a tough issue. It really is, because take your home and you've got a bunch of maintenance backlog. Do you go out and buy that second home in the country, and then do you buy a third home in the country? At the same time, we really need to protect more lands in this country for nature. We continue to hem places in. And one of the issues I'm trying to explore in detail is, can the national park system slow the sixth mass extinction? And a lot of people believe it can, but at the same time, you need a great amount of public lands to make that happen. Right. And right now, you can look at the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. I mean, Yellowstone's about 2.2 million acres, but you throw in all the national forest lands and BLM lands and state lands around it, and it grows to anywhere between 18 and 30 million acres, depending on how you look at it. But, so that's a fairly intact ecosystem. And yet you go up to Glacier National Park in the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, there's a few hundred miles or so between Yellowstone and Glacier, and you really need to make a connection so you can have the dispersal, the genetic dispersal, and the mixture going on between them. And I just am not sure that there are enough places, enough ecosystems like those in the country to benefit nature.
Yeah, I understand what you're talking about. Well, it's interesting that the Great American Outdoors Act is established to revitalize the Land and Water Conservation Fund. And I just want to take a second and emphasize the land and water part of this. A book was written recently, not recently, maybe about 8 or 10 years ago now, that talked about the land and water in the United States. And the point of that book was that it's the land and the water that has made America the powerful nation that it is. You can argue about democracy and all of the other political kinds of things that make up the United States of America, but this book argued that land and water was really the most important thing. Everything from the coastline to the rivers to the watersheds, all of those things collectively contribute to the greatness of the United States of America. I call the Land and Water Conservation Fund the act that saved America, actually, because had there been no Land and Water Conservation Fund, these ecosystems that you just described would have been compromised, and the nation would not be the nation that it is today if that had happened. And I think that somehow gets lost on people. They think, well, Land and Water Conservation Fund is just about acquiring parks or acquiring land for people to recreate in and plan, but it's really about keeping species intact, keeping environments intact and ecosystems intact, and contributing to the overall health and well-being of not just the environment, but the people that live in that environment as well.
That's true. And of course, we need the political will to benefit from those lands and waters. You look at the North Cascades ecosystem, and we've been going back and forth for years on whether or not to help recover the grizzly bear in the ecosystem. And former Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke was for it, and then they were against it, and then they were for it again. And just recently, Interior Secretary Bernhardt decided that wasn't such a good idea after all, and we're going to put it on the back burner. So, politics unfortunately plays a great role in how we benefit from these lands and these ecosystems.
Yeah, there's no question about it. So you've been running this magazine. You have a podcast. How did you get started in doing this? You've been at this about 15 or 20 years now, haven't you?
Seems like forever some days. It's an interesting story. I had worked for the Associated Press coming out of college, fortunately enough to land with the AP. And I spent 9 years in Wyoming running the AP operation there. And so obviously Yellowstone and Grand Teton and Devil's Tower, Bighorn Canyon, a lot of federal lands. So that was part of my daily beats, what's going on there. And I got well connected with the Park Service because I always had a soft spot for national parks. When we left Wyoming and moved to Utah, I launched my freelance career. And George Berklacey, who I think you might know, was Chief of Communications for the Park Service back then. This was 93, I believe. And one day he calls me up and he goes, the Idiot's Guide wants me to write a guide to the National Park System. Mm-hmm. And I said, no, I can't do that, but I know somebody who'll do it. So he said, Kurt, you want to do this? And, being a freelance writer, you're always looking for work to do. So I said, sure, that sounds great. And so the Idiots hired me to write this Idiot's Guide to the National Park System. And I don't know, I think we had a dozen or 18 parks, and I was, bouncing all over the country trying to, cover the parks and what's in them, where to stay, where to go, et cetera, et cetera. I finished the manuscript. I turned it in, and believe it or not, the Dummies people bought the manuscript from the Idiots. Uh-huh. And so the Dummies gave me a whole new contract on top of what the Idiots had paid me. Mm-hmm. And I went to work and I revised it and I added a couple parks, and I was waiting for the morons to come along and buy it. But anyway, as I said, I've had an early connection with national parks and the outdoors and public lands, and I've always loved them and been very fortunate to live in Wyoming and now in Utah, where, there are so many national parks within a short drive. Mm. And this was back before the dot-com boom really took off. And I was trying to freelance with, major magazines across the country. And so to come up with story ideas, I started my blog, National Parks Traveler. And by doing that, it forced me to, find story ideas that I could pitch to magazines. And along came the dot-com boom, and a lot of magazines shrank or went out of business. At the same time, the readership of the Traveler kept going up and up and up. And so I had discovered a niche, and we've built it up, and we're probably reaching 3 to 5 million people a year, largely through the website and Apple News. But we do have a weekly podcast that we launched in mid-February of 2019. Mm-hmm. And we've had over 114, I think, over 114,000 downloads. Mm-hmm. So we're really trying to reach as many people as possible in as many formats as possible. Somebody told me that people who listen to podcasts don't necessarily read, and people who read don't necessarily listen to podcasts. So I figure if I can cover those two bases, I'll reach a pretty good audience.
Well, I guess we're exceptions to the rules because I know you read a lot. I certainly read a lot, as well as listen to podcasts, although I'm a little selective in the podcasts that I listen to. I think I still do more reading than not. But speaking of national parks, let's ask a very simple question that I get asked all the time, and that's what's your favorite park, if you have one?
I saw that coming.
Of course.
I'd mentioned that growing up in New Jersey, the Garden State, although people will question that moniker, we got National Geographic, and one month there was a story about this guy who lived in this place where in the wintertime he would go up onto the roofs of buildings to shovel off snow so the buildings wouldn't collapse. And lo and behold, this was Steve Fuller in Yellowstone National Park, and he lived at Canyon, overwintered in Canyon at Yellowstone National Park. And so Yellowstone's always had a soft spot in my heart. I mean, it's just a fantastic landscape between the wildlife and the geothermal, the rivers, the lakes, the mountains. For me, it's just got everything. But, it's like asking, what's your favorite child?
Yeah.
And so, I could probably answer, it depends on what week it is, because I was in Acadia National Park in July of 19. Great park, loved it, fantastic. Glacier Bay National Park, another favorite. You can just go on and on, as you well know.
Well, an interesting story for me. I think you remember the former Parks Director, California State Parks Director, and of course, National Park Service Director Bill Mott. And
Sure.
Bill used to get asked that question all the time, and he finally, I don't know if he got tired of being answered that question, but he finally came upon an answer that he used every single time. He simply said, "It's whatever park I happen to be in at the time."
Right.
Which is true of the national parks. I mean, they're really special places, and I think they have a special place in the heart of most people in the United States. Ken Burns did, of course, his special on national parks, and national parks, of course, continue to be characterized as America's best idea. I was talking to another journalist not long ago, and he said, as much as I love parks and I'm an environmental, journalist, he says, I have to totally disagree with that concept. And I said, well, what do you mean? What would you call the best idea? And he said, well, the Declaration of Independence, and which is kind of hard to argue with. But I wanted to ask you what you think about that. Do you think they're two different things, or would you say one is better than the other?
That's a tough question to answer, but certainly without the Declaration of Independence, we wouldn't be here today in the democracy that we live in.
That's for sure. I think you can probably say they're almost in two different categories, and I think you can say you certainly couldn't have one without the other. Again, the land and water in our parks are an important part of the fabric of this country, and certainly the Declaration of Independence is an important part of our political fabric, as well. So the next thing I wanted to ask you about was COVID-19 and the unforeseen consequence that more people would visit the national parks as a result of the confinement brought about by COVID-19. So people wanting to escape confinement, get out of doors and not be around too many more people. The result has been more visitors coming to national parks. And many of those visitors have never been to parks before, don't have any kind of park etiquette. There have been reports that they've been trashing the parks by writing their names on rocks, carving their names in trees, and just generally trashing the parks. And as I said earlier, not having much of a park etiquette. Is that something you've tackled in your magazines or written about much?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, just a few weeks ago, I was talking to the superintendent of Crater Lake National Park in Oregon, and he says that from his discussions with other public land managers and from his own experiences and seeing what's going on in Crater Lake, that there has been a new type of camper, if you will, or outdoors person coming to the national parks, and they're not exactly schooled on the etiquette. Specifically, he was recounting stories of people thought Crater Lake was a place you could go down and swim, and they were taking their scuba gear down there and inner tubes and other flotation devices. And of course, if you've been to Crater Lake, you've got that roughly mile hike down to Cleetwood Cove, and you get down to the bottom and there's no restroom facilities because of the situation with COVID and resources and manpower, and people were just heading off along the shore of the lake and finding a place to squat. And so they had to re-educate a lot of people in terms of how you treat nature. It's kind of interesting going back to the centennial of the Park Service in 2016. I was talking to a number of superintendents, and Jeff Bradybaugh down at Zion National Park was talking about the people who would go up the Narrows and have these little dance parties and bring their boom boxes and the crowds. And he said, we've got to educate these people on how to experience national parks and how to treat national parks. And that's a tough bill to serve, I think, don't you?
I do, and the reason that it's come up for me is that I spend a lot of time surveying the National Park Service fan page on Facebook, and there is a lot of anger that's been expressed on the Facebook page for the National Park Service fan, and some people are just downright, hostile and apoplectic about the fact that people have been misusing parks, and that's been a challenge for parks for some time, and I think it's just become a greater challenge. So not only are there not the resources for maintaining and policing the parks, but not the resources for educating people. So I think the situation gets exacerbated by the fact that we're in this pandemic, and it was one of those things that wasn't foreseen, one of those unforeseen, consequences, negative things as a result of the pandemic. You want people to visit parks, to get outdoors, but then you have this whole group of people who just don't seem to understand, park etiquette. So maybe this podcast will help. You keep doing your blog. I'll keep podcasting about it and writing about it on Facebook, and hopefully we can get the general public a little bit better educated about this particular problem as well.
Well, I think the problem's been coming down the pike for some time, though. Going back to 2016, it was kind of interesting. A couple of years before that, it might have been 2014. I sat down with then Director of the Park Service, John Jarvis, and we had a wide-ranging conversation. And one of the points he raised was he thought that the American public, the national parks, were losing relevancy with the American public. And of course, if that was the case, then it certainly rebounded in 2016 with the crowds that came out to the national park system. And I think, a lot of parks were overwhelmed. And the Park Foundation came out with its campaign, Find Your Park. And, behind the scenes, rangers were saying, find another park, because they were overwhelmed with visitors. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a situation that the Park Service hasn't quite come to terms with. So certainly we've seen a lot of new people coming to the parks because of the COVID crisis. But before that, there was still an overcrowding crisis, if you will, in a great number of parks that they haven't quite figured out how to deal with. Yeah. Some of them have. I mean, at Acadia National Park in October, we're going to see they're going to have a trial run of their reservation system. Right. But there are a lot of other parks: Zion National Park, Arches National Park, Yosemite National Park, Grand Canyon National Park, Glacier National Park, Yellowstone. You can just keep going down the list. That they just see huge crowds of people, and while that's good that they're getting out to appreciate the parks and love the parks, sometimes they're not always doing it in the appropriate ways, and the Park Service does not have the manpower to police them. I mean, just the other day, there was a video out of Yellowstone National Park where some kids, as it were, on dirt bikes were out chasing bison.
Oh, my God.
Yeah. And the Park Service doesn't have the personnel to be everywhere, especially in a 2.2 million acre park. So I think there's a huge problem with visitation that has to be addressed in some form.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned Zion, Yellowstone, Yosemite, for example. I know for years, in fact, I worked with John Jarvis on some of these issues, particular at Yosemite with respect to reservations. And even though there are reservation systems in place now at just using that Yosemite as an example, and there is a transportation system in place. Ironically, those systems have somehow exacerbated the problem. And the reason is because with the transportation system, you can bring more people in some respects. Well, in a lot of respects, you can bring more people in. So you have the transportation system, you have the reservation system, and so you have more people that are coming in as well. You may have reduced some of the clogging on the highways, but the number of people coming in. But I think it also gives you an opportunity because some of those people are in concentrated areas, and you certainly have an opportunity to educate people as well. But I think it is going to be an ongoing problem. But from your point of view as a journalist and somebody that's covered the National Park Service for a long time and the environment in general, what do you, if you had to point to something that maybe nobody else sees coming down the pike? I mean, if you were doing a strategic plan and somebody said, well, what is one of the greatest threats out there that we may foresee in the future? I mean, for example, nobody saw COVID-19 coming and the impact that it would have on parks. So from your point of view, somebody who's close, is there something you see coming down the pike in the future that we need to be concerned about?
I'm not that prescient. I think climate change, obviously, and a lot of people know about climate change. I mean, we're looking at these massive wildfires in California and these incredible hurricanes in the Atlantic, the glaciers melting in Glacier National Park. The national park system is going through some incredible changes, and some of them might be fundamental changes. And sea level rise is going to inundate many of the parks along the coast. So we've got a lot of those issues come along. Certainly, development and hemming in national parks and how that's impacting nature is a critical issue that has to be addressed in some form or fashion, or the National Park Service is going to become a zookeeper of sorts. I mean, you look at Isle Royale National Park, where they had to bring in wolves because climate change had ceased the creation of ice bridges, from the mainland out to the island to allow wolves to come back and forth and interchange genes. And so, is that just a rare case, or are we going to see that more often? It's an interesting quandary that glad I'm not a park manager.
Understand. Well, on another level, I know we talked about this a little bit ahead of time. You mentioned your experience at Acadia National Park, but has there been some, one experience that you can point to as a human being that was transcendent for you, that really changed the way you look at the world, and maybe even changed your worldview as a result of your interaction with the park or with the natural environment?
Well, there's been a lot of incredible experiences I've had in the national park system. Skiing, cross-country skiing to the north rim of the Grand Canyon, climbing the Grand Teton, running rivers, wild cave tours at Mammoth Cave National Park. It's just, really cemented my love for and appreciation of nature. And I think that's one of the big reasons I write National Parks Traveler, is to inform people not only of these wonderful places and the wondrous experiences you can have in a national park, but also of the threats that face them. Because, without education, we'll squander what we have. And so, just getting out into nature in the national parks, being able to escape the 21st or the 20th century We've gone on river trips through Dinosaur National Park and able to take my one son with me, and he loved it because there was no email, there was no texting, there was no cell phones. It's just out there in nature. And so really gaining an appreciation for nature.
Does it sometimes make you feel, more connected to the universe as a whole? I mean, we've all seen that big blue ball that was taken on the first trip to the moon, and you look back from space and you see the Earth. Does your experience in nature sometimes make you feel more connected, more alive, and instill more of a sense of awe and wonder just about the fact that life itself exists?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it's incredible being able to get away and just surround yourself with nature. But at the same time, it also increases almost anxiety over what we're doing to that big blue planet out there, and looking at development and pollution and disregarding nature. At times, it's concerning because these are incredibly special places, and you would hope that a century from now, people would be able to enjoy them the way we've been able to enjoy them.
Well, it's interesting. It brings up for me back to my early career in terms of reflection. I mean, I left the medical profession at age 30 to become a ranger, which my parents were like, "What the hell's the matter with you?" But anyway, the thing that fascinated me the most, and the thing that was the most attractive, was being an interpretive ranger and being able to instill a sense of wonder and awe in people. And so when we talk about the National Park Service and we talk about rangers, and when we talk about what we're supposed to be communicating, you have the people who come to parks to recreate, which is wonderful, whether it's river rafting or mountain climbing or whatever it would happen to be in terms of recreation. But the individual ranger, especially an interpretive ranger, plays an important role. And I just had Shelton Johnson on the show, who's I think is the quintessential ranger, interpreting to people what it means to be in a natural environment and in a park, and instilling this sense of wonder and this sense of awe, so that people don't end up abusing the environment that they're in. And I think because we don't have enough personnel, enough interpretive rangers, talented people that can person to person do that kind of communication, I think you lose an important ability to connect people the way it was originally intended for rangers to do in parks. And you must have experienced that yourself and written about that in your blogs.
Yeah, from time to time, and you raise an excellent point about the declining ranks of interpretive rangers. I remember once my wife and I were down Canyonlands in the Horseshoe Canyon annex, as I call it, of the park, going down to the Great Gallery. And we went on a ranger-led tour. And during that tour, in my conversation with the ranger, a young lady, she was getting out of interpretation and going into law enforcement because that's where the jobs were with the Park Service. And certainly law enforcement is an important role, but I hate to see the interpretive ranger disappear and vanish, because you have that interaction. You have that ability to connect with somebody and connect them with nature. And I don't think your cell phone can do the same job, even though you might have a great interpretive program on that cell phone, because your cell phone won't answer questions.
Yeah. Well, I certainly remember my first experience at Yosemite back in the 50s with interpretive rangers, and Bill Lane, who we talked about earlier, was one of those interpretive seasonal rangers who was actually in charge of yelling up the mountain to push the bonfire.
Firefall.
For the firefall. And I remember the lasting impression that had upon me. But interestingly enough, there were other experiences in interpretive rangers that back in the 50s that we should not have had, and fortunately have ended. I mean, there was a time when interpretive rangers at Yosemite would take you to the garbage dump because they had this big, huge garbage dump in Yosemite. And at night, the rangers would do a tour or a hike to the garbage dump so that you could see the bears and
Right.
at the garbage dump. Unfortunately, both the firefall and that particular interpretive program ended as we learned more about how people should be interacting with the environment. But I often reflect upon that. Those are fond memories from my childhood of visiting Yosemite National Park. So any final thought you want to leave with us about parks? Anything you want to communicate to the public about parks in particular?
Well, I just think that the public should enjoy and embrace the national parks and experience as many of the different parks, both the natural resource parks and the cultural and history parks, because there's so much to learn in so many different areas. At the same time, hopefully during their visits, they'll pay attention to some of the issues in the parks that the parks or the Park Service are facing, and really nudge their congressional delegations that, hey, $6.5 billion through the Great American Outdoors Act is a great start, but we have to properly fund the parks year after year after year. I mean, I don't ever expect the maintenance backlog to get down to zero, but certainly it'd be nice if it got down to a more manageable level. And we could have those interpretive rangers in the parks because they make such a difference. They really do. And they can inspire so many young children, young adults into careers in science and exploration and rangering. So I think it's just a wonderful, wonderful atmosphere to surround yourself in.
Absolutely. And you did mention at the end our historical and cultural parks. And I don't think people realize that there are far more units of historical and cultural parks than there are the big national parks that we think of, Yosemite, Grand Canyon, or Yellowstone, or Glacier. And there are many more historic parks as well. And the whole history of our nation is embodied in those parks as well. And I hope people get a chance to visit some of our cultural parks as well. Kurt, thank you for joining us. I really appreciate you giving so much of your time. And I encourage our listeners to support the National Park Service Traveler. And you can go to our website, lifeisastorypodcast.com, where we'll have a link to National Parks Travelers, your blog, and your podcast, and the work that you do on behalf of national parks. Thank you, Kurt.
Well, thanks for having me, Don. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of the podcast, Life is a Story We Tell Ourselves. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and share with your family and friends. You can also find us on the web at lifeisastorypodcast.com. From our family to yours, stay safe, share happiness, and remember, the important thing is not to stop questioning. Curiosity has its own reason for existing.